That's because we treat mental health so differently than physical health. It's something that we push away, something that we decide doesn't really relate to us. If we don't experience mental illness in our life, then we just put it aside and decide that it's not something to be discussed because it's an awkward topic or it's not appropriate in normal conversation. Now, I have an anecdote to share with you to show you a little bit about the stigma in terms of what mental illness looks like and what people look like who live with a mental illness. So for my borderline personality disorder, I was in an inpatient treatment program for about 5 months, about four or 5 years ago. It was a residence for women with BPD. There were 10 of us in the house, and we actively worked on our symptoms and the behaviors that were causing problems in our lives every day with dialectical behavior therapy. Now, the other women in the house and I were allowed to put in permissions to exit the program for outings once in a while. And one weekend we decided to put in a permission to go out for sushi. We were very excited. So we all went out for dinner, and on the way there we stopped by a store to do a little bit of shopping. We were shopping, we were having a good time, we got to the cash, and the young man behind the cash, I'm just gonna say, was quite handsome. And I started chatting with him. And he asked me for my phone number, and that's when my friend Allison, who was also in the program, piped up and made a joke, and she said, "Oh, she's a mental patient, you don't want to date her." And we all laughed, and we left it at that. I took his phone number and we left. We started text messaging back and forth for about a week, and eventually he said, "I'm really enjoying this conversation, I'd like to take you out sometime." And I responded with, "What my friend joked about has a grain of truth to it, and I live in an inpatient program for a mental illness, and I don't believe they will give me a permission for a date, as that just complicates therapy and symptoms and that kind of thing." And when learning that I was an inpatient in a mental health program, he just brushed it off and thought I was joking. And he said, "Oh, you're so funny. Okay, so when are we going out?" And I had to explain it to him again. And he finally got the idea and understood what I was saying and realized that I wasn't trying to blow him off, I wasn't lying for a joke, it was the truth. And he happened to be very understanding about it, but to me what it spoke to was what people assume somebody with a mental illness looks like. We think of the person on the street corner who's talking to themselves, or somebody who can't get out of bed every day. But that's not the truth for everyone, and if we have somebody in our lives who suffers from a mental illness, we might know that from looking at them every day, being able to pick themselves up, go to work, go to social events, yet they're suffering at the same time and they're having a very hard time. And that's why we need to make it more accessible and more normal to talk about. We need to normalize mental health and mental illness. We need to be able to go to that dinner party and say, "It was really difficult for me to get here tonight. I'm suffering from depression and I had a hard time getting out of bed." That should be a topic that can be broached appropriately in conversation, that can be considered something that we can discuss. And it still often shocks people. And it's important to remember that because that's stigma. And stigma can be insidious. It creeps in with misconceptions and judgments and eventually turns into something much more dangerous. And it can be quite harmful. And the best weapon we have to combat stigma is talking about it, is our voice, our experiences, being able to be a safe, compassionate space for people to discuss mental health. I'd like to share another anecdote with you, which I think drives the point home. For the past 8 years, I've been training in a sport called Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And if you know what the sport is about, you would know that we train in a gi, which is like a kimono. And we create grips with this uniform that helps us secure positions, advance positions, gain points, etc. Now, I was training with a training partner. This was a few years ago. I knew him well enough. I felt comfortable. I thought we were just going to have a training session like we always do. We started standing and he grabbed the sleeve grip on my sleeve and my sleeve rode up. And he saw the scars that run lengthwise up and down my wrist and he looked at me and he said, "What, did you try to kill yourself or something?" And I looked at him in the eyes and I said, "Yes. Do you want to talk about it?" And I could see the shock on his face. I could see how bad he felt at how gauche his question was, and he just didn't really know what to say. But at that point, I felt that it was a moment for him to realize either you ask respectfully and you try to educate yourself, or you don't ask at all. And that's why we need to be that open, safe space. And I hope that in that moment, that was a learning experience for him, to realize that it is something we can talk about, but it has to be spoken about with compassion and with kindness and with support. And he didn't ask me to explain. He didn't ask any questions, and that disappointed me a little bit because I was hoping he would be hoping to learn a little bit more, but at least I hope that he left thinking about it at that moment. And that's something that I'm fairly open about, my suicide attempts. There have been 3. The last one was very serious. I found myself in a coma for a week, and it made me realize after going through all of that there must be a reason that I kept coming back from it. There must be a reason that I was still here. I remember waking up from the coma to a green blob in front of my eyes, and then I realized that was my stepfather in a green shirt. And my first thought was, I'm not even his kid, and he's here for me. He's right there, he's glad that I'm still here, and he's supporting me. And it made me realize that if we're willing to be open and compassionate and be supports in our lives for the people that are suffering, that's gonna help their recovery, and that's what's gonna break down that stigma. So with the strength that I got from my family members, from my stepfather, from my friends, from everybody who was around me rallying to help me get through this, I realized there must be a reason that I was still around. And part of that reason, I believe, is that, as was explained in the introduction, I'm a volunteer at Distress Center Durham, and I started that work with the hopes that I could help provide a service that I would have used if I knew that existed when I was in my darkest places. And through that volunteer experience, I gained so much experience, so much knowledge. I learned so much about myself. I was able to partake in all kinds of invaluable training, and that led me to developing this passion for mental health and this passion for using my lived experience to help others. And that led me into my career, and I have everything to be grateful for from Distress Center Durham because they really led me to where I am now. And I now give talks and workshops on mental health, and I use that experience to make mental health more accessible, more real, more raw, and for people to understand that they're not alone. A good example of this is a few months ago, I was speaking at a college in Coburg, and I was helping with their crisis intervention unit. So there was, of course, educational material, information to be shared, but I made sure to include my personal story. And I told them about living with bipolar disorder, suicidal thoughts that led to serious attempts, living with borderline personality disorder, being in an inpatient program, what that journey of recovery was like. And after I spoke, when I went home, I realized I'd gotten a message through my website, and the message was about this long. It was quite long, and it was one of the students who detailed to me all of her experiences. And the message at the end was that seeing me with a diagnosis similar to hers, being somebody who was well-spoken, put together, successful, I'd like to think, gave her hope that she could be the same way, that she could do the same. And she was working in a program studying rather, in a program that's a helping profession. And I entirely believe that that experience that she's been through, similar to mine, will help her be closer with her clients, offer more compassion and more kindness, and being able to understand what they're going through and share in that empathy. And so that meant the world to me. I was happy to be there, to be able to share in their crisis intervention unit and participate and offer what I have to offer. But if just that one student sent me that message, that made it all worth it for me. So that's what I try to do. I try to be vocal about what I'm experiencing. I try to use it to help people understand better and help them feel less alone, because like I said, stigma is harmful and insidious, and it sneaks into everything that we do if we refuse to be open about mental illness. So I use my story to encourage other people to be open as well, and I find that when I share what I've been through, it opens the door for them to do the same. And it's been a huge part of my recovery as well. It's helped me understand better where I came from, what I've been through, what kind of strength it's given me. I'm asked sometimes if I could take a magic pill or wave a magic wand and get rid of the illnesses that I live with, would I do that? And it's a really complex question, but honestly, I don't think I would. Through everything that I've lived through, it's given me empathy, it's given me the ability to connect with people. It's shown in me a strength that I never knew I had. And being able to live through those experiences has given me ultimately my passion and my purpose. So it is difficult to live with. That's something to remember. I once had a partner who said, the behaviors and the symptoms that you go through with your BPD and your bipolar disorder certainly can be difficult for me, but I will always remember that it's more difficult for you and you're the one living with it. And that was hugely supportive to me and very important to hear. So that's one thing to remember when you talk with the people in your life who are dealing with a mental illness. To remember that this is something they live with every day. It's something they have to face all the time, and they might not show it, but it definitely affects them, and they need that support and that understanding. And perhaps it'll help you understand yourself better as well, and even if you don't have a diagnosis, it's worth reaching out for support when you know it. That's how you maintain and cultivate good mental health and be able to stay healthy and balanced. So even if you don't live with a diagnosis, it's so important to seek that support, to work on bettering yourself, to understand what it is you're struggling with, and in turn that will help you understand better the people in your life who do live with mental illness. So really the message that I want to share is for people to be open to the fact that talking about mental illness can be appropriate in a conversation. Maybe a 3-minute elevator ride isn't quite the time to say, well, my anxiety's been really, really bad lately because of this and that, and I'd really like to talk about it, and can you help me? But there's a time to approach that same person with that same topic that would be very appropriate and allow them to have a door into your world and be able to support you better. We need to make it a topic that isn't scary to broach, especially with something like suicide. I try to use the word as often as I can when relevant because people shy away from that word. People are shocked by that word, they refuse to talk about it, and it's something, as was mentioned before, that is hugely significant in terms of what people are suffering with in this country, what people are dying from. It's incredibly important. And research has shown that speaking about suicide openly and candidly greatly reduces the chances of somebody going through with an attempt. So that's incredibly important to remember, especially when it comes to youth, because they can often feel so misunderstood and so unheard. And it's important for them to know that those topics are something they can broach, something they can talk about. When I speak in high schools, I often say, if you're thinking of suicide, you may think that your darkest places are too scary for people to understand. But the only way to get out of those places is to share and get the support that you need. Or alternatively, if somebody you know is thinking of suicide, you may be thinking that using that word or talking about it will put ideas in their head. And again, that's entirely false. Talking about it will release those emotions, give them an outlet to be able to talk about it and find the support that they need. Mental health and physical health are exactly the same. They affect us the same, they affect our lives, they affect how healthy and happy and balanced we feel, and it's very important to be able to talk about both. I find that whenever I've had a physical injury, I've gotten more support than I have when I mention a mental health episode. And that has changed a little bit as the people in my life are getting more educated, and they are incredibly supportive and loving, so I'm very grateful for that. But in general, I can definitely see the difference from a broken arm or a torn shoulder to a depressive episode or a manic episode, for example. It's so important to remember the power of our words and the power of the way that we approach people and how we can be compassionate and kind to them. And like I said, that opens the door for them to seek the support that they need, because it can be so difficult to reach out for help. It can make us feel weak. It can make us feel like we have a shortcoming, something to overcome. And it is something to overcome, but not in terms of something that is wrong with us or that we've purposefully done. It's something to overcome in terms of finding our strength and pushing forward with the support of the people around us, and that's why we all need to be better supports for ourselves and for the people in our lives. And recovery, it's really important to note, is never linear. It's not going to be a straight line. Recovery will often be 3 steps forward and 2 steps back, and you have to find that strength to keep moving and the supports that help you do that. I spoke about recovery for the Distress Center Durham, I believe it was last year, and I spoke about my journey, and there were definitely ups and downs. There's times when I was maybe less open to treatment, I felt more hopeless, I felt like nobody could truly help me and I wasn't dedicating myself or committing to the treatment that I was receiving. But in the end, I realized that I have to keep pushing forward and keep working on what it is that's making my life difficult. I like to talk when it comes to mental illness and mental health a lot about accountability. And by that I don't mean responsibility. I don't mean that you are responsible for your mental illness and it's something that's your fault, but I mean that you are accountable for how it affects your life and how it affects other people's lives. So it is the onus is on you to go through the treatment that you need to work on your symptoms so you can have a healthier, happy life and be healthier and happy for the people around you. And that's what being accountable means, but it doesn't mean that it's your fault. So it's sort of this fine line between learning that we have to take our mental health into our own hands and be willing to put in that work, but being compassionate with ourselves and understanding that it's just something we live with and it's not something that's our fault or that we do on purpose. And that's an important point to remember as well for people who are supporting people in their lives who have mental illness, to let go of that blame and to approach it with compassion and understanding that it's something they have to live with that can be quite painful. And when we let go of that blame, it opens the door for them to be able to receive that support and look for the help that they need and work on that accountability without feeling guilt for it. Because that will just further perpetuate stigma because we're placing it on ourselves at the same time. Stigma is something that can only be fought with words. It's something that we need to talk about, we need to be open about, we need to use our words to reduce the judgment that surrounds mental illness, to reduce the misconceptions that surround mental illness. Just like that young man in the store who didn't believe that I was a mental patient, he probably had a misconception that a mentally ill person is on the street corner talking to themselves, like I said. And while certainly some mental illnesses can present in more severe ways and they can be more disruptive to someone's life, it's not always going to be visible. And that's when we need to keep an eye out and check in with the people that we love. Not just, have you been taking your vitamins? There's a flu going around. How are you feeling? Are you getting enough sleep? How's your mental health? How are you doing? How's stress at work? How are you feeling on the inside? These check-ins are so important. And like I said, being able to talk about it will open the door in both directions for being able to be open, being honest, and supporting each other. It's incredibly important to be able to do all of that. I know I've jumped around a lot, but the message essentially is to talk about it and make it appropriate to talk about, make it something that we prioritize, something that we educate our children on. It's so important for youth to know what's going on with them, when they're allowed to reach out for help, which is always, anytime, and that seeking help isn't a weakness, and it's actually a sign of strength. We need to give them the tools to be able to recognize when they're having a mental health problem or when they're not quite feeling right, which is something that I didn't have as much when I was growing up. I remember the first time that I mentioned that I wanted to kill myself, I was about 10 years old. And the friend that I shared it with told her mother, who then told my mother, who then did the responsible thing and asked me if I'd like to go speak with someone. And she asked me how I was feeling and tried to inquire. But being 10 years old, I was shy, I was scared, I didn't even understand what I was feeling, and I refused to go see someone. And there is no blame on my mother at all. Parents use the tools that they have. They love their children so much and they do the best that they can. There's very little way she could have forced me to go see someone. But there wasn't that education and that general awareness in society to understand that it was something I was allowed to do, that it was something that perhaps I should do. And it wasn't until my 22nd birthday, I believe, my brother made an appointment for me with a psychologist. And that's when I was diagnosed and we started working on everything and the behaviors and symptoms that were affecting my life. And again, it wasn't straightforward, it wasn't linear. There were lots of ups and downs, and the suicide attempts came after I had started treatment, which is something that might surprise some people. You might think that I would seek treatment, find the treatment that's appropriate for me, start getting better, recover, be a perfectly normal person, whatever that means. And that's not the way that it works. It's definitely up and down, and it's something that you need constant support with, and something that requires compassion and understanding. So I like to share that story to show people that there's always hope that it will get better, even if you reach a roadblock, an obstacle that you have to go around or sometimes smash through, maybe painfully, but it's always worth it. It's always worth it to do that work, to push forward, to try to get better, to work on what's affecting your life. And like I said, to remember that it's not your fault. And if the people in your life can remember that as well, then you'll have double the support that you need to be able to take on that journey. So what I want to leave you with is just really the understanding that mental illness can affect anyone. Mental illness can look like anything, anyone of any gender, sexual identity, ethnic background, anything at all, any occupation. Anybody can have a mental illness, and it's important to remember that when we interact with people, because we never know what they're going through. And perhaps if we speak about what we're experiencing, we can allow them to speak about what they're experiencing and then find support in each other, and that's an incredibly powerful thing. So I hope that you'll remember the power of words and the power that you have in being able to offer compassion and empathy. And I hope that you'll be able to carry that in your daily lives, both for yourselves and the people in your lives, and be able to provide that support and remember that mental illness is always appropriate to talk about. It's always something that we need to discuss, we need to spread more awareness on. Educate yourselves, talk to the people in your lives who are experiencing mental illness and ask them respectful questions. I guarantee you, very few of them will not be open to talking about it with you and helping you understand better. I know that I've remained very open about it because I've realized how much it helps people feel less alone. Just like that student who shared with me that she had a similar experience and was so inspired by what I went through and where I am now. When I speak in high schools, I often get a similar experience with many of the young students, and that makes it all worth it for me. To know that for them talking about it is that key that opens the door to be able to seeking support, to feeling less alone, feeling less like the weird kid that something is happening to that they don't understand and everyone else seems to be doing fine but they're struggling. So it opens that door to that conversation and to seeking out support. So I just really encourage you to stay aware of the people in your lives who might be struggling and share with them what you're going through so that they have the opportunity to share with you as well. And if we can have that open, candid, compassionate conversation about mental illness, we can help combat stigma. And like I said, talking about it is the best way to do that. Talking about mental illness may very well save a life. Thank you.